Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review United States of Terra. So, going into this show, I really actually did, I found my way into enjoying it, even though there were some things that I didn't 100% like about this show. There were some times where they kind of added extra characters in that ultimately had some qualms of which that I did not enjoy. But recently, when going on into this show, I thought that most of this show was kind of interesting. I thought reasonably the approach of the show was really just kind of fun to watch Tara eventually go from Tara to any number of these personalities that eventually have to kind of be tied into some story. I While watching this show, I otherwise realized I'm like, oh no, Brie Larson is on the show. Nothing wrong with Brie Larson. It's like there are some times where I've watched a Brie Larson thing and I'm like, wow, I actually liked Brie Larson in this movie or this show or this whatever. Um, Sadly enough, in this, Brie Larson wasn't exactly something that I wanted more of in this show, so I guess that's a negative thing. Recently, there's a character that gets added in, and ultimately gets kind of like phased out, and that character I did not like on the show because repetitiously she just kept mentioning of a problem of her past, where ultimately she was just kind of kept throwing it out there and continually throwing it out there to the point where I was like, how about we just throw this character out? Because I'm tired of this person mentioning this thing, and I want this person to just go away now. They're getting too like the thing that they take and they ultimately mention. I'm just like, how are you gonna keep blurting that out? And on top of that, it's like the way that they approach how they talk about this. I was like, that is a horrible that is a horrible way of talking about that. Like, shut the f up. To be brutally honest, because ultimately I was just very angry and upset about one person mentioning about something that I'll mention in spoilers. So ultimately, when going into the show, I was really happy that Patton Oswalt was in the show. Just because reasonably we have him to be kind of Max's kind of best friend or a wingman kind of thing, and I thought that was interesting. Max, we seem to have a character that is seemingly like. I think the more and more that we go about this show, that I think more and more Max is just going to lose his effing mind, I think. Max is ultimately Tara's husband. Ultimately, Tara being the main focus in this show because ultimately, Tara busts into multiple personalities. And so Max has to be the one that has to wrangle and or deal with whatever personality that Tara is going to have at some point in day. We ultimately have it to where uh, Charmaine, ultimately being Tara's sister, is ultimately to also kind of this entire family has to deal with every beck and whim of Tara and whatever Tara she's gonna unleash onto the world today, because we have it to where every single one of Tara's personalities basically is on a path of seemingly either self-destruction or just some kind of destruction of some sort. To ultimately we have it to where a lot of these other side characters have to wrangle Tara and ultimately make it so that uh, doesn't she doesn't do something to otherwise destroy the relationship that with Max and ultimately with other portions of her family. So they ultimately have Max, who ultimately cannot sleep with any of the other personalities that are ultimately in this show, which I thought was fascinating. I'm like, so this guy is otherwise seeing several variations of his wife, which ultimately he cannot sleep with because reasonably those aren't actually his Tara. It's just a variation of her, which ultimately he cannot be with or he cannot um, sleep with ultimately because he had promised his wife, and then reasonably it's just like, well, a lot of the times the alters, as they say, like every single one of them eventually hit on Max, and he is just like, no, like I don't want anything to do with any of them, with the exclusion of just Tara. So I thought that this show was rather interesting. I thought recently when watching this, I was like, you know what, like you could really just say that this show really relies too much on the multiple personalities or just Tara and there's nothing else going on. And that's true because I think this show like holds way too much on Tara. It's like, man, you're really like putting the you're really putting like the entire show on this woman's shoulders reasonably and or unreasonably, I guess. To ultimately succeed. And surefire enough, I guess, with it having multiple seasons, it did. Funny enough, I watched and the like the intro that ultimately this show was funded by Steven Spielberg. So I'm like, like wow. Um, so yeah, Steven Spielberg put his freaking name on this, and I'm like, wow. So like this show, like who knows how long um, or who knows how long that this or how much money was sunk into this show. I thought it was kind of rather interesting that we have a character like I thought that we were probably gonna get like Tara and she'd have like 20 different personalities that were all gonna be shelled out and like mixed around. Like I was assuming like this was going to be like the movie Split, where we'd have like the Terra Prime, like but then we'll mix like we'll have every little bit of thing where we'd have like 12 different people all being Terra in one episode and kind of fighting for that time in the sun. Whereas in this show we have very much lesser than 12 personalities that are all fighting for, if anything, we kind of have like one personality per episode or kind of per like shifting of time, I guess. So but like Terra is ultimately like Terra Prime, but we ultimately have like eventually variations of Terra at some point with different names and stuff like that, and eventually we have one uh, character of Terra that ultimately is kind of undefined yet of what exactly this is. But anyways, I honestly thought the show was really interesting. When reasonably looking at it, I think Tara having the kids that she does and ultimately having uh, like kind of the interesting aspect of way of which they were going about this, because we have to where Tara doesn't like she doesn't really have friends. She doesn't really have friends. She just has her sister and her family, and that's like it. So it's not like they're consistently having like friends come over, and then all of a sudden, Tara goes into her personalities. We have it to where Tara is just by herself, and I think really reasonably that's where all the I think where reasonably all the problems happen is really just that Tara is just kind of having nobody really to truly to lean on besides her family, and that's about it. So I think that's all that I wanted to talk about in a very cryptic like sense. I thought that this show was enjoyable, and plus two, I think it's nice that it kind of like pushes that adult kind of approach where ultimately you have it to where uh, every one of Tara's personalities is hitting on Max, and basically a lot of times wearing the skimpiest outfits, which is also good. When also looking at it, but then we also have like Tara. I don't know. I'm not gonna call her Tara Prime, but ultimately Tara is the main personality out of everybody, and then everybody else just kind of comes in on certain episodes, and then people just have to deal with it. Like that's the real tough thing or tough pill to swallow within these episodes is everybody's going to have to like the personnel is going to come in, and whoever is in the backseat to whatever this personality is ultimately going to moan and groan and whine and cry for the whole entire episode about having to deal with X personality. And I can kind of find that annoying, but like you have it to where there are some personalities that are like so dominant and are basically just like I like the personalities are just basically like, well, I don't give an F. I'm gonna do whatever I want, and ultimately we have it to where everybody's just chasing after this personality. So ultimately, I just thought this show was interesting, and when looking at it, um, I thought it was just rather just like it was interesting to see eventually when Tara would become Tara how Max was kind of desperately trying to get their alone time, or Max would end up having to give himself some alone time, if you know what I mean, in the shower, because recently we have it to where Tara's even when she is there, it's like, well, like she's just going to slip into some personality, and then I'm not going to be able to have my time with my wife. Or we have it to where ultimately uh, any simple moment of Max just bringing something up is going to switch Tara to somebody else. So ultimately, we have Max who's just kind of like, God, I just. Like, you can kind of tell sometimes where Max is just like, God, I'm just so sick of Tara. Like, I am just so tired of this. Like, just having to just, like, get into like having to wrangle this person because knowing full well they're going to end up in jail at some point. So let's go into spoilers about this show. Let's ultimately crack down and ultimately just go into every little bit of interesting things going on in here. So ultimately, we have a handful of personalities that ultimately is going to be within Terra, just a handful. But eventually, I'm assuming at some point later down the road, maybe quite possibly, we're gonna maybe have more than that, which I think would be interesting. Um, so let's go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time I'm going to spoil this show. So again, we have Brie Larson on this show, and I groan, but because reasonably I don't like her story at all. But like I think with this one, I don't really enjoy the actual story of either one of the kids. Marshall, ultimately, Kier Gitchelrist or Kyer. I had just seen him in the show Atypical, and I love him in that. In this show, I could care less that he's on the show. Brie Larson, I've never I couldn't find exactly in my mind one Brie Larson movie that I really fully enjoyed. But her story in this, I'm just like, God, I can't wait for just like, could we get rid of these kids? Could they go off to college and it just be like Max and Tara or something? Like eventually we have it to where like the kids were going to go off and live with their grandparents, and I was like, yeah, go kids, because I don't like your stories at all. Like these stories are just kind of like really flimsy, and it's just kind of like a lot of their stuff is just like either flimsy, or it's just like whatever the story needs is kind of like whatever time killing thing that ultimately they need for this show is ultimately going to be the kid stories, because ultimately Tara is going to take up a bulk of this time. So let's ultimately talk about Tara. So Tara has quite a couple of personalities. You ultimately have Tara, who is ultimately prime personality. Then we have ultimately Alice, which is a very old fashioned, I would call it Leave It to Beaver kind of character that ultimately is kind of to the point of when Bree is ultimately kind of mentioning some scandalous stuff. We have it to where Tara is washing Kate's mouth out with soap, just because it's a very old fashioned thing to do. Ultimately, Alice bakes a lot, and we ultimately have it to where reasonably Alice is just ultimately she's just a very old fashioned gal. So that's two. So we have T that consistently shows up where it seems like her personality is that she's a 15-year-old girl, and that ultimately she is um like very much like I would probably call her like a valley girl, or like one of those like I would probably see her as one of those girls that's like the most popular girl in school, but she's no longer in school anymore. So like uh she's very reckless, she's very rebellious, and basically don't tell her no. Basically T is the person that ultimately um she's kind of like the monkey wrench. She's basically the person that is otherwise going to do some stuff that she probably should not do. And so that's the third personality. We have a fourth character named Buck, I believe, or yeah, I think his name is Buck. I could be wrong. Um, Ultimately, we have it to where Buck is a man. So Tara is playing a man who is Buck that ultimately seems to be really enjoying adult movies consistently. It seems like this person fights people and is a person that probably gets drunk a lot, has accidents after getting drunk, meaning like crashing into stuff or whatever. Um, And then also, we seemingly have some undefined personality that seems very animalistic that comes out during uh, the visit of Tara's parents. Ultimately, it seems to be some kind of caveman ish like character that seems to just bizarrely just urinate on people, which is bizarre. But other than that, I think we've kind of wrapped up all the other personalities, unless there's going to be at some point some other personality that I've yet to see, which ultimately that'll probably happen at some point. So, so we have it in here where ultimately we have Tara who, uh, every single time she ultimately gets stressed or ultimately deals with some bombshell, we have it to where Tara switches to some personality. I think most of the time it's probably T, but it's usually T, Buck. I think Alice is kind of like every once in a while she pops up, or like she kind of pops up when the story uh is to a point of kind of fitting her use, and then ultimately like she'll pop up. Um, we have it to where Bulk is just Bulk. Book, the other one. Uh, we have it to where he is to have like comedic relief, like uh, he's to be put in the worst possible situations to have this personality arrive. To ultimately, everybody's going to moan and groan when that person comes in, and ultimately, we have it to where T is ultimately a character that is going to separate herself from the rest of the family, and ultimately, we have it to where T is ultimately going and really almost putting a fork in the road of Max's relationship with Tara. Because reasonably we have it to where, like, Max, like in this very first episode, we have it to where when Tara switches to T, it seems that T is ultimately, like, throwing herself at Max, and Max is ultimately telling her it's like, it's not going to happen. Like, if anything, it's like we have it to where T is like throwing herself at him, and we have it to where Max is like. It seems that Max is ultimately like getting a stiffy whippy for some of these personalities to the point of him just ultimately looking at him and like, because we have it to where ultimately every single one of these personalities, we have it to where T is wearing like the skimpiest of clothes, and to where ultimately Max is kind of getting turned on by that, but he won't follow through with it. And ultimately, we have it to where Alice comes in, and she comes in into having a very much interesting lingerie-ish garb as well, and ultimately she is to pour whipped cream on Max to ultimately get interested in being with him. But and so we eventually have it to where Tara is consistently asking Max, it's like, dude, did you do something with Alice, or did you do something with the other personalities? And we ultimately have it to where Max is like, no. Like, if anything, like, we have it to where when Max is ultimately talking to Patton Oswald, which is ultimately Neil ultimately says, like, hey man, like, you've hit the jackpot. It's like, when looking at it, like, this girl is all kinds of different flavors of cereal, and you could dip your spoon in at any time, and there would be no problems. And we ultimately have to where Max is like, no, I can't do that. Like, it's not right. And ultimately, we find out that Max's only real wanting is of Tara. And it seems like Tara will also experiment and ultimately adventure onto trying to please Max. But also, it seems that eventually, when Max wants to have his romantic time with Tara, we switch into having Buck, or I think I'm probably ill pronouncing that. The personality that ultimately is the guy. Um, Ultimately, we have it to a reasonably any number of these adventures with any of these people kind of create for interesting stories. Kind of, we have Buck who wants to go bowling, or we have T that ultimately wants to go to an arcade, or like every single one of these personalities has a built-in like, okay, well, this personality likes to do these specific things. Like, it really feels like they've kind of created like backstories for all of these personalities, and we ultimately have it to where Buck ultimately is to have some kind of military background, which isn't true. So while that is going on, we also have Charmaine, who is Tara's sister, that like I don't know what her play is. Like, I don't know if she's trying to hit on everything that moves, or Like, I'm kind of like, it seemed like Charmaine was even like throwing herself at Max at the very early of the show, and I was like, what is going on here? Like, I was just kind of thinking that like at some point in some episode, we are eventually gonna have like Max like finally confess to Tara that ultimately he had slept with all the alters, and then we're gonna finally see a scene that ultimately proves all that, and we're just gonna be heartbroken by eventually Max ultimately like losing his mind and ultimately giving in to all of these alters. And like I thought that that scene would have been the most interesting. Like, if you want to save that for a season finale, that would be like explosive to ultimately see like, okay, in the entire next season we're just going to cover the this moment. But that ultimately didn't happen. So we have it to where Max is ultimately just dealing with every personality that comes up. We ultimately have it to where uh, Charmaine ultimately is going and having to redo her melons, let's just say, her chest, because ultimately she had done surgery on her chest, and ultimately they did it incorrectly. They botched it, so ultimately she had to go back in to have somebody correct it, and we ultimately have it to where if not Tara is ultimately kind of putting her goods out there to be seen by everybody. We also have Charmaine that is ultimately at some point going out of her way to reveal her goods, I guess, at some point as well. But ultimately, yeah, because like all the females on the show are really like throwing it out there, I guess. But anyways, so we ultimately have it to where Kate ultimately is seemingly a person that just can't deal with things anymore. It seems like she is at first going and having unprotected bedroom business with some guy and justifiably needs the morning after pill. That's what sets that's what sets Tara off in the early episode to switch into T. And then T, we find that every personality is telling every single family member the truth. We find that like T's other personalities are ultimately telling like Max the truth, Marshall the truth, Kate the truth about what Tara truly feels, or whatever Tara had found out. Ultimately, the alters will tell. Like T ultimately told Kate that ultimately Tara had found out about her morning after pill, and so Kate eventually felt betrayed. So going into here, we have it to ultimately every single one of these personalities is eventually like T's throwing herself at Max. Max doesn't want anything to do with it, and so we eventually have it to where Bulk ends up going into a bowling alley, and they all have to kind of really go and bowl because ultimately Buck wants it. But eventually, we have it to where Kate is to ultimately go into having a job, and immediately I'm like, oh, okay, so this is gonna separate her from everyone else, and so ultimately we're gonna have like we gotta have it to where every single one of these the kids ultimately has to separate. The dad has to kind of separate. He has to have a job. We have a Marshall who ends up going into some bizarrish like Halloween bizarro church thing, which ultimately I had no clue of understanding what the heck that was all about. We have Kate who goes into her job, which ultimately leads her into seemingly going and having a relationship with her boss. But eventually, when that relationship doesn't come out to exactly the way she wants it to, she ultimately like calls her boss a creep, and then ultimately like goes and tries to get him either fired or like try to get a lawsuit on this guy or this company for ultimately like harassment and all this other stuff. So, which ultimately I hated that whole story. So, but eventually we have it toward Tara eventually is to I think at the very beginning of this, we have it toward Tara. I think is getting a like a business kind of going, a small business with Charmaine. At some point to kind of sell stuff. So we end up having it to where eventually Tara is to spill to one of Charmaine's co-workers that ultimately she is a personality or a multiple personality person. Because ultimately we have it to Charmaine who ultimately talks to this person that is there to ultimately they had some retreat that they went into to ultimately see what their biggest problem was, and ultimately Charmaine's biggest problem is Tara. And we ultimately find out that this woman's biggest problem is that ultimately she had been molested. So here's the character and the problem that I have. So we have this person that ultimately mentions this act way too often, and it feels like it's just an easy thing to just keep going back to ultimately just say, hey, like this happened to me, and so I need to mention it again. And I'm like, I don't like this person, because ultimately at some point that she had said that like that happened to her, and then that she was glad that it had happened. I'm like, why would anybody say in their life that they were glad that happened? Evidently, this person has never had this happen to anybody that they know in their life or themselves or whatever, and I don't get that at all. I think that's very insensitive, and I think that this character is ultimately just a garbage character that ultimately has never uh, like obviously this person has never been through this problem, and it kind of really seemed blatantly obvious how insensitive this character was, and ultimately this character could not have getting rid of quick enough. So because ultimately they go to a kitchen dinner, the three of the girls, and we have to we ultimately have the one girl who would ultimately that is ultimately the this person that I do not like ultimately is wanting Tara to just at the snap of the whim change to a personality. Because ultimately this girl wants to see what it's like. Oh, could this person just switch to a personality so I can just see her change repetitiously just to see? And we ultimately have a Torterra's like, dude, I'm not a dancing monkey. Like, it's not a light switch to turn on and off. And so ultimately this girl throws again this whole thing at her again of like, well, yeah, but come on, like I had this happen to me, of course, before. So reasonably, that is the real crux of me ultimately saying that, like, yeah, I want to see something crazy. I want to see you turn. I want to see you change your personality. And I'm like, this is garbage. This woman should shut the f up. And ultimately, I just hated this character. And ultimately, when we have it to where eventually uh, we have it to where Tara is painting a mural for this person, and then eventually, like in the mural, eventually he says like, "Die you slut" or whatever. I was like, yeah, like, cause I hate this character, and thank God that this resolved ever seeing this character again. because this character was such an insensitive thing to ultimately be put into the show. Because ultimately, I just hated her, and thank God that like it wasn't a reoccurring character, because I thought that was stupid. So we eventually have it to where eventually Tara was thinking that that girl was going to be her friend, and then realized that ultimately that wasn't working out. So the next thing is to ultimately figure out which one of Tara's personalities had scribbled that lettering on that wall. And so we have to have it to where Max is trying to figure out which personality would do that. And Tara's like, I don't know. I don't think it would be Buck, because ultimately Buck would say something else. So ultimately they kind of compile it that it had to be a T, because ultimately Alice is too nice. So we have it to where eventually uh, when Tara turns to T, eventually we have Max, who is ultimately to kind of interrogate T, to ultimately be like, why did you write that on the wall? Why did you do that? And we ultimately have it to where Tara's like, I don't remember doing that. Maybe it was somebody else. Maybe it was one of this girl's boyfriends or something. And so ultimately, they never quite figured it out. Nothing was ever resolved. And I was like, God, that is the stupidest thing. Where it's just like, man, we'll just take so much. We'll just take an entire episode to figure out who had done this, for ultimately there to never be a resolution, and we just move on. Um, so eventually we see this character called Alice, who ultimately uh, comes into the school to ultimately give a person a big cake of sorts, or a big a big cake. And ultimately we have it to where eventually Alice is to speak to Marshall's teacher, and it seems that ultimately Alice kind of speaks to this person in such a way that ultimately the teacher apologizes to Alice for singling her son out. So we eventually have it to where eventually we find out that eventually Marshall is put into some uh, via some guy that is ultimately at his school. We have it to where Marshall is going into this church place that is ultimately going to try to convert people. If they're not straight, then ultimately try to make them that way or something like that. Ultimately, kind of showcase the wrongs of ways of which the people might be living at some point. And they are going to do that through some haunted house that looked bizarre to me. I was like, wow, they are really going out of their way to try to do something so different in here that it is almost absurd to do this. And I'm like there could be a lot of people that could find this really offensive and whatever, but I'm like, hey, they're taking this risk, and just go on ahead for it. So eventually we get to them doing a haunted house, or what would be their odd variation of a haunted house. And I just thought a lot of that was just like, whoa, like this is such like this is such a different approach to trying to do a show. But I don't know, I was so intrigued by its oddness. I was intrigued by its approach. But also I was intrigued by consistently Tara, where a lot of times he would just be wearing uh just the most revealing clothes or something like that. So that's also a win in my book. So going on into this, so we eventually have it to where Marshall out of this gets seemingly a boyfriend. We are to ultimately kind of mention that Marshall is ultimately gay, and that's completely fine. So we have it to a reasonably like, and also the joke is like Marshall ultimately like wears clothes that ultimately looks like an old man wearing clothes. It looks weird at some point, but anyways, so going on into here, we eventually at the very opening of this show, we have it to where Kate is ultimately having some grungy looking emo kid that eventually Buck has to go and beat the crap out of just because Tara doesn't like this kid, and so eventually Buck has to just beat the crap out of him. Um, and so eventually we have Kate who ends up uh, going and very much going into dating this guy that otherwise is not quite right for her. But it seems like reasonably, it seems like Tara was using her boss, or Tara, Kate was using her boss, but also her boss was kind of using her as kind of a back and forth kind of thing. Because eventually, Kate at some point like is pretending that she's sick so she could leave for the day, and like the more and more that they went with this whole like Kate in this boss in this job angle, I was like, I really hate this story. The further and further it went along, I was like, I really don't like this story. I wish that it would end, or I wish that ultimately they would have Kate do anything else. Ultimately, the time of which that eventually Kate, and I'm gonna be bouncing all over the place with this one, with this review, so it's not all going to be clung together. Um, but eventually, we have Kate who ultimately goes and uh, has a kind of a getaway with her mother, and they eventually get tattoos, and it seems that Max is going to be pissed about it. That ultimately they had gotten tattoos, but it's like, who cares? Ultimately, Tara had gotten it because ultimately it'll always remind her of Kate, and that'll keep her bond strong. So we eventually have it to where seemingly consistently Marshall is ultimately feeling consistently left out to where his parents or his family just doesn't care about him. To where ultimately we have it to where uh, Max and Tara are going to, or is supposedly going to see something that Marshall is doing. And Tara ends up going off onto an arcade, and we have it to where Max has to leave to ultimately go and try to grab Tara or T from this arcade, where ultimately she is basically throwing herself at some guy and ultimately getting Max to be kicked out of this arcade. So we eventually have it to where in this show that recently we have it to where at some point Tara's parents arrive, and we justifiably have it to where ultimately Tara's parents are ultimately consistently mentioning that how about their kids live with them instead of with Tara, because Tara is a handful to deal with. And so eventually we have it to where consistently the father of Tara is ultimately waking up consistently and seeing that he had peed himself or peed his bed. And but we find out later that it seems that uh, there is some altar that ultimately is a animalistic thing that is just peeing on people and then leaving. So, and ultimately that's the shocker of it all. And we ultimately have it to where the kids ultimately are staying where they are, and we ultimately have it to where Max is throwing on the fact that ultimately he knows that Tara's father had peed himself and this and that. So it's kind of a joke. So pushing on. So we have it eventually where Tara is ultimately coming to be too hard to handle. To her ultimately Max is ultimately talking to Tara's therapist. It seems like Tara's therapist like doesn't know jack crap nothing, to the point where I think she's just listening to her. But it's like, is this person really a therapist? Like, it doesn't really seem like she's making really any progress, or she's ultimately just eventually going to just pass the buck on to somebody else at some point. Um, so we have it to ultimately, because Max is desperately going to this therapist for answers, and there is none. And so recently, Max is just like, well, I'm effed then. Like, we ultimately have it to where Tara is telling Max at some point that ultimately her therapist no longer wants to uh, deal with her kind of thing. And to her, ultimately, um, her therapist is going to have Tara go to some like specialist. So we have it to roll to me, yeah. Every single one of these family members are like, heck yeah, like send her to a specialist, send her off somewhere. Good God, because we ultimately have it to her eventually. Max is to have his boyfriend come with him. Well, technically boyfriend, but ultimately maybe not. Um, Jason. Technically Jason. So we have to Marshall is kind of really trying to he's spending a lot of time with Jason at this religious slash weird uh, kind of acting class, I guess, of sorts. It's weird. Um, but anyways, we eventually have Marshall and Jason, who seemingly eventually kiss at some point, and that eventually it seems like they're gonna have a relationship. And Marshall brings Jason home, and T is ultimately there to uh, kind of take Jason and take Jason to her shed, where ultimately when she needs a timeout, she ultimately thrashes and bashes her way through this shed, which I thought was really interesting. So we eventually have it to where T takes Jason to the shed and ultimately kisses him, and we have Marshall uh, who sees his mother kissing his boyfriend, and so we have it to where the anger of Marshall gets way too much. Told me he burns this shed down, and so I was like, wow, like so are we gonna see that like this Marshall kid is gonna be because he's ultimately been like neglected by his family and reasonably there's just a lot of times where they're just kind of going like meh, like I think he's fine, so ultimately I don't need to talk to him. If anything, kind of Kate is the more problem child, so nah, we need to spend so much time with Kate and F anything that Marshall's really doing because reasonably he's not a problem child, so like we don't need to really need to take time with him or do much with anything with him. So a lot of times Marshall is just a character that's just there. It's just wait for eventually them to come up with a story for him because otherwise he's just going to be just there. So we have it to where ultimately the shed is burned down and we have it to where Tara's like, well, I can't blame Marshall for burning the shed down, but we ultimately have it to where Max is ultimately telling Marshall, it's like, you know what you did was wrong, right? And he's just like, meh. Like, if anything, like, the burning down of the shed is really just having this family basically tell Max, it's like, you know what, it's time. Like, it's time to really, like, this, like, we have it to where ultimately Tara had taken medication to ultimately, I guess, subside these personalities, but eventually she had tried to get off this medication to deal with her problems, and ultimately this really isn't working out. And so eventually the family is all coming to Max and saying, like, you know what, we're gonna need a bigger boat. Like, I think it's time to get this to get like this like fixed with Tara. Like, this is only getting worse. It's like it's ruining every person in this family. And so recently we have it to where like Tara's even going like, yeah, I think they're right. So we have it to where Tara is going in uh and here's another thing. So we ultimately have it to where Tara is supposed to support her sister after she has gotten uh vital surgery that she needed. Yeah, correcting a fudge up with her chest, and like she's like Charmaine keeps repetitiously mentioning that it's like real like high end whatever like vicious surgery that she needs done, and it's like, no, it's elective surgery. You don't need to do it. So we eventually have it to where Charmaine is ultimately saying like, Tara, you need to be there to watch over me and help me and whatever. And we have it to where eventually uh, Tara ultimately flips into Buck, and so really when Charmaine ultimately is dealing with her surgery and the aftermath of that, being swollen and all kinds of things, we have it to where the worst possible personality comes in to ultimately like consistently like give her crap, and ultimately just like, oh, quit your whining kind of thing. And ultimately we have it to where Buck is ultimately just watching whatever he wants to watch, and ultimately like we have it to where Charmaine is ultimately just like, God, like, can't you just like take care of me? Can't you just like make me feel great? And eventually Buck does that, and eventually he's going to like shampoo her hair while she's in the shower, and then eventually Tara turns back, and we have it to where ultimately Charmaine is to confirm that actually Buck was a a good partner to be with recovery surgery. So we eventually have it to where again we're gonna need a bigger boat, and so reasonably we have it to where Tara is ultimately going to a specialist, and we have her just kind of just stay there. And so we also have Max, who is needing, excuse me, he's also needing to go and see this therapist as well. Ultimately, to go into here and talk about the problems that he has with Tara. And recently, everybody else is like sniffing that out and is like, dude, like, how about you talk about you, how this is affecting you instead of how it's affecting Tara? And so eventually we have it to where Max is like, dude, I don't think this is working out for me. Like, man, like I just want to complain about Tara all day, and I can't do that. Um, but anyways, we have it eventually where uh, Tara is speaking to this new doctor, and it seems like her personalities won't come out. To where eventually they have to like hypnotize her and all kinds of things and drug her to pull these personalities out, and eventually they do come out. And so eventually they're trying to figure these things out, but eventually we have it to where Tara eventually is desperately asking to go home. Um, because eventually we have it to where Max is trying to figure where the trigger of all these personalities had come from. We ultimately find out that ultimately Max had gone to Tara's old roommate, and we found out that ultimately Tara had cheated on Tara had cheated on or had an like Tara had a roommate, and ultimately she had slept with that roommate and with that roommate's boyfriend. And so ultimately, in the end, like we find out that this guy had ultimately like maybe took advantage uh, of Tara, and so now we have to kind of like investigate all this. Which eventually they have the guy show up, and ultimately we have it to where this guy is mentioning that like yeah I did sleep with her. I have problems sleeping ever since that happened, and we have it to where Max is listening to this like dude like like this girl has been scarred by this, and you're just saying that you can't sleep at night. Boo hoo for you, buddy. We ultimately have it to where, yeah, Tara had blocked out that whole situation. Like, we find out that Tara has blocked out so many things, that ultimately there's so many stories that she doesn't remember in her life. And we ultimately have it to where there are characters coming in and ultimately giving us her backstory because she doesn't know her life. She doesn't remember a good portion of her life. And so we have it to her ultimately, I think, when some people are to remind her of her backstories, we end up having like a switching of personalities, I think a lot of times there was some like a memory triggers maybe some personality or something like that to come in, so maybe they're going to figure that out or perfect that, um, and so anyways, yeah, I thought this show was kind of interesting from that, and reasonably, I think that's all that I wanted to probably mention. I think there was a lot of stuff that I could ultimately go through. Eventually, it seems that eventually, when Charmaine eventually has a birthday party, eventually that is to be basically ruined by this entire family. To where eventually Charmaine is to ultimately just lash out at everybody because ultimately the presents that she had gotten was nothing that she could do anything with. Um, but then eventually we have it to where Charmaine is kind of like mentioning eventually while she's yelling that like where she was kind of just forced into basically ending up, and ultimately she was forced into ending up having a bad chest job of sorts, and to ultimately she rips her shirt to ultimately showcase this bad chest job. And we have it to ultimately, I guess, her parents had flipped over the check to get her a improved chest, let's just say, and ultimately leading to her buck had to take care of her afterwards. So yeah, I think that's all that I wanted to say about here. Like, reasonably, we have it to where seemingly Charmaine is eventually going to probably end up with Patton Oswald's character, and that I thought was really interesting. To ultimately, we have it to where seemingly, like, Charmaine is eventually going to end up with someone. Eventually, we are very unsure whether or not Marshall is going to end up with Jason or not. It seems like they had kind of a falling out, but eventually Jason tried to make amends. But in the end, who knows where that's going to go? We end up having it to where Jason's boss, Kate's boss, ultimately is being super creepy to the point of even like coming to Kate's home and just kind of like coming in unannounced and just being somewhere in her home. To ultimately, Kate backs out of her driveway with her car and just drives off, like ultimately not coming home to this guy because he ultimately collects pictures of her. He collects all kinds of weird things, and he does kind of weird videos to where ultimately Kate is just really unpleased by this man, and so ultimately we have it to where Kate is ultimately going and just feeling just like I want to get a million miles away from the. Uh, Kate has it to where she wants to get a million miles away from this guy. So reasonably speaking of that, yeah, I think there's not much else for me to talk about in here. I like this show so far. I think reasonably the personality thing. I think it's interesting, but I don't think it creates enough havoc. I don't like. I think it's just kind of, especially when we get like the Buck kind of portions. I'm like, oh, okay, well, this is just kind of like be a character that's kind of offensive and this and that, but like there's we have a Ortiz kind of like the annoying character that I think is just like, oh well, we're gonna use his character to try to like have maybe T seemingly seductive or whatever. Like, but anyway, we have to where eventually Alice is just kind of like the Leave to Beaver esh like person, and like that is what that is. We eventually had like Charmaine eventually going and having Tara go and do a massage thing, and that ended up getting horribly awry, where T ultimately was to lash out at people and probably pee on the ground at some point because ultimately she had turned into the animalistic character, and so that ultimately leads like Charmaine to ultimately just watch over the kids consistently while Max and Tara ultimately go off to their institutes, if you know what I mean. But anyways, I think that's all that I want to say about here. So I'm going to get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Goodbye, everybody.